everyone, so today I'm gonna be explaining to you a little bit about heart sounds. So are you ready? Let's get started. As a brief reminder, this video is not meant as a medical advice at all. So if you do have any heart complaints, please go to the doctor. And if I do make any kind of mistakes throughout the whole of this video, please do let me know in the comments down below. Please bear with me for a while, guys, because I am also still studying, and please forgive me if there are some kind of mistakes throughout this video. Okay, so let's get started for real this time. I'm gonna share my screen. I hope you can all see it in a little bit. Right. So before we know all kinds of different heart sounds which signs for abnormalities, we should know first the normal heart sound. So the normal heart sounds, we have S1 and S2. S1 is the closing of the atrioventricular valve, and S2 is the closing of the aortic or pulmonary valves, which is, we usually call it A2 and P2. So when here I'm drawing a diagrammatic representation of the heart, the left atrium is separated from the left ventricle by the mitral valve, while the right atrium is separated from the right ventricle by the tricuspid valve. And from the right ventricle, we have the pulmonary arteries, which has the pulmonic valve. And from the left ventricle, blood will go on to the aorta, which has the aortic valve in the beginning. So let me share you the normal heart sound. As you can see, as you can listen in this part, we have two sounds, closing of the AV and then closing of the aortic or pulmonary valves. Yep, I hope that is all clear. I'm gonna start again to show my screen. Now let's begin with the systolic murmurs. We have three main kinds of systolic murmur, which is the mid-systolic murmur, the holosystolic murmur, and the late systolic murmur. The mid-systolic murmur, as the name suggests, is also called a crescendo-decrescendo murmur. Why? Because it begins during the systole, and as it approaches the middle of the systole, it becomes more louder or crescendo, and then it will start to diminish the sound, and that is the part that we call decrescendo. The pathophysiology of this sound is when we have, let me just move it down here. Yeah. Is that what happens during systole? We have to remind ourselves is when the ventricles are contracting. What happens during the ventricles contract? It's the blood will flow through the pulmonic and aortic valves. So as the pressure builds up in the ventricles, as these ventricles contract, the blood will be pushed to the aortic and pulmonic valves. And if there is stenosis or narrowing of the valves due to different reasons such as calcification and other things, if there is the normal channel through the valve, then in stenosis it will be smaller like this. So because blood flows through a very small channel, that it will produce a sound, and this is these mid-systolic sound, because the pressure needs to build up as the blood flows through the aortic and pulmonic valve, and as the volume of blood decreases, then the sound will also decrease. Now, let me share you the sound of the aortic stenosis or the mid-systole. Yep, can you hear that? So in this case, we heard the first hot sound is there is something like a murmur here, which becomes louder and then becomes less loud again. It's called a systolic ejection murmur. Right. To remind you again, the um, the aortic sound, if the murmur is caused by the aortic valves, then it will be heard at the second intercostal space, right sternal border. While if it is a pulmonic, it is due to the pulmonic arteries, the pulmonic valves, then it will be heard in the second intercostal space in the left sternal border. Aortic is the right and pulmonic is the left. So moving on to the holosystolic murmur. So holosystolic murmur happens when there is an immediate flow of blood, which causes a constant murmur. So the murmur doesn't get louder or less loud during the systole, but it is it is stagnant like that. And what happens if that murmur happens is that we have the ventricles contracting. Remember that it is a systolic murmur. So when the ventricles are contracting, this murmur is caused by the blood flowing back through the atrioventricular valves like this. So because the blood immediately flows back due to these valves not closing properly, we have an immediate sound of a normal, of a constant amplitude of murmurs. So if we listen to the sound of the holosystolic murmur, it goes like this. Right? If we compare it to the last one, this one is more of a constant amplitude and pitch. And remember that it happens during the systole, so it's right after the first hot sound. So this murmur is caused by tricuspid regurgitation and mitral regurgitation, as well as the VSD or ventricular septal defect. There are only three causes of this very unique murmur. Right. That is what happens in holosystolic murmurs. Now we have a late systolic murmur. So late systolic murmur happens if we have a heart here and then the mitral valve is prolapsing. So if the mitral valve is prolapsing, we usually hear first a mid-systolic click before the murmur then begins. So this the late systolic murmur is caused by the mitral valve prolapse or the MVP. As you can hear, let us now listen to the sound of the mitral valve prolapse. Just a little bit. Right? So listen to that. There's a very slight sound of the mid systolic click before there's a murmur that goes until the second heart sound, and it becomes louder as it approaches the second heart sound. So this mitral valve prolapse is when the valve slits are bulging into the left atrium as the ventricles contract. And this is usually, when this happens, there's also regurgitation. So the blood will flow back to the atrium. These are usually asymptomatic, and this is usually best heard when the patient is in the left lateral decubitus position. So next, we're moving on to the diastolic murmurs. Right. For diastolic murmurs, we generally have only two. The first one is the early diastolic murmur. So this one is the systole after the first heart sound, and after the second heart sound is diastole. Again, the diametric representation of the heart. So this early diastolic murmur is caused by blood immediately flowing back into the ventricle as the ventricle relaxes. So it is caused by aortic and pulmonic regurgitation. So you can see here, blood will flow back here. Remember that the ones that happen very early is when there is a regurgitation. While in systolic, we need to first build up that pressure for it to increase, and then after that, it will like start to begin with louder murmurs. But in stenosis, because we need to like push the blood against this narrowed valve. But then if we have regurgitation, we do not have to build that much pressure before the blood goes into throughout that valve. So it's an early diastolic murmur, which becomes less loud as it progresses, because it's a decrescendo murmur, because as the blood from the aortic and pulmonic arteries, from the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, it starts to decrease in flow. The sound or the murmur will also start to decrease. Now we can see. Now let me share the sound of an early diastolic murmur due to aortic and pulmonary regurgitation. Now, let's let's differentiate this with the systolic murmur. If the systolic murmur before happens right after the first heart sound, this one happens right after the second heart sound. So yep, I think that is enough for the heart sounds. And then I'm gonna make another sharing of the screen. Spin a little bit. Right. Next is the not an early diastolic murmur, but it's a mid diastolic murmur. So the mid diastolic murmur happens again when the ventricles are relaxing because it's diastole, then the blood will flow. This happens in the mid diastolic. So when the ventricles start to relax and then the blood first, if it's early, then it's the phase in this phase where the blood flows back from the aortic and pulmonary pulmonary valves. It causes the early diastolic. But if it begins in the middle like this, it's the phase when the atria are contracting as well. Remember, the diastole starts with the passive relaxation, and then after that happens, the atrium will contract. So what we have here is that after the blood flows throughout the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, the blood will also flow back again to the ventricles. And if there is stenosis of these valves, then we will have the murmur. It's the mid diastolic murmur, which happens in the middle of the diastole. So let me share that sound again for you. So this is, for example, due to the mitral valve stenosis. So the S1 will be very loud because of the valve thickening. And then in this case, because this is the mitral stenosis, this is there is an opening snap before there's a low pitch decrescendo crescendo diastolic murmur. So it becomes so it becomes less loud, and then it becomes louder as the atria contract. Okay, so next on, we're going to move on to the gallops. I hope you can see the screen, but it's not there yet. Oh, wait a minute. Right. Okay. Right. So we have two kinds of gallop: the S3, or what is known as the ventricular gallop, and also the S4, which is the atrial gallop. So S3, or the ventricular gallop, this could be a normal murmur in children or some individuals, but this is also abnormal in heart failure, for example. So what happens is that as the blood flows through an overly compliant ventricles, this will cause a murmur just after the S2 or just after the second heart sound. So while in the S4, S4 happens because of the ventricles are not compliant. So blood will flow like this, but because the ventricle is not compliant, then there will be a sound just before the just when the atria are contracting. So this is why the place where it contracts. So S2 is the S2 is when the atria when the aortic and pulmonic valves close, right? And then the ventricles will relax in this phase. So the ventricles will relax, but and then just in the middle after the passive relaxation of the ventricles, the atria will contract, and that is why the S4 happens late, just before the first heart sound, late in diastole, while the S3 happens early in the diastole, because in the S3 it is when the heart just begins to enter the ventricle. So let me show you the sound of those. See that? This one is heard very clearly when the patient is in the left lateral decubitus position. And there's like that sound after the S2. Now, compare it with this one, which is the fourth heart sound. Right? This is an atrial gallop. It's very different from the S3 because here the additional sound is closer to the first heart sound rather than the second heart sound. This is not a normal finding. And this is usually because of the diastolic heart failure. And diastolic heart failure commonly happens if there is a hypertrophy of the heart. Okay, so let's moving on again to the next. Oops, I forgot to share my screen. Okay, so the last two heart sounds. The last two heart sounds, this one, we see here a continuous murmur. If we look at the previous ones, we have the systolic murmurs which happens between the S1 and S2, and the diastolic murmurs between the S2 and S1. But in this case, we have a continuous murmur, which means that the murmur lasts throughout the whole of the systole and diastole. However, this murmur becomes louder during the systole because this murmur is found in the PDA, or patent ductus arteriosus. So as we remember about the congenital heart diseases, one of them is the PDA, in which there is not supposed to be not a connection between the aortic and pulmonary arteries. This is the aorta and this is the pulmonary arteries, but in the patent ductus arteriosus, the channel between the aorta and the pulmonary arteries does not close properly. So yeah, during the systole, we have a very larger pressure. Remember that the pressure which is in from the left ventricle, from the left side of the heart, is much larger than the pressure from the right side, because the left ventricle needs to pump throughout the whole body. So during the systole, we have the larger sound as the blood crosses this PDA, this channel from the aorta to the pulmonary arteries. But then during the diastole, there is still an amount of blood flowing through that. So it's a constant murmur because the blood continuously flow through that abnormal channel. So let me share it with you, that sound. Yep, listen to that continuous murmur throughout the whole systole and diastole, but it becomes louder during the systole. Okay, so next is moving on to the combination of the heart sounds, which is the to and fro murmur. As the name suggests, this murmur is to and fro. It happens during the systole as well as the diastole. In the systole, this is a mid-systolic murmur, and this is an early diastolic murmur. So remember, the mid-systolic murmur is happening because of the blood flowing through a narrowed outflow of the ventricles. This one is the systolic murmur. And then what happens is that we also have this early diastolic murmur, which is caused by the, I'm sorry about this regular representation. Let me change that a little bit because this more commonly happens in the aortic valves. So the early diastolic murmur, remember that it happens just after the ventricle starts to relax, which means that the pressure starts to drop down below the pressure in the aorta, and this is when that murmur happens. So this happens in valves where there is both aortic stenosis and also regurgitation at the same time, and this is what we call a to and fro murmur. And in the pulmonary valves, the same case happens. So, right. So this, but this more commonly happens in the aortic valve rather than the pulmonary valves, right? So let me share you a little bit what that sound. Right? There's like this sound which becomes louder, and then there's an immediate sound after the S2. So there's a murmur that, okay. Now, for the last part of our review of, so a quick recap. In systolic, we have the mid-systolic sound, which is caused by the narrowing of the aortic and pulmonary arteries. We have the hollow systolic, sound, which is caused by the regurgitant tricuspid mitral or VSD. And we also have the late systolic murmur, which is commonly accompanied by a mid-systolic click caused by the mitral valve prolapse bulging from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. And for the diastolic, we have the early diastolic murmur, which is caused by the aortic and pulmonary arteries regurgitation. And there's also the mid diastolic murmur caused by the narrowing or the stenosis of the mitral or tricuspid valves. For the gallops, we have the ventricular gallops or S3, and we also have the atrial gallop, which is the S4. And for the continuous murmur, we have the continuous murmur for PDA, which becomes a bit louder than this during the second heart sound, but I'm sorry, but a bit louder when it's in the systolic phase. I'm sorry, but I think this might be a little bit incorrect, but yeah, the form is like that. It becomes louder and then less loud and louder again, less loud again. And there's also the to and from murmur because of the both aortic stenosis and regurgitation, or pulmonary stenosis and pulmonary regurgitation. Yeah. In reporting, please do remember that we have to describe the murmur, the location of the murmur, the quality of the murmur, and also the grade of the murmur. Remember that the systolic murmurs have 6 grades. The ones that we commonly hear very easily is grade 3, and when it is grade 4 onwards, we have the trill, or it is palpable on the surface of the patient's body. And for the diastolic ones, we have 4 maximum grades, and as usual, the third grade, grade 3, is when it starts to be heard clearly. Okay. So I think that is all that I can share with you guys. Thank you very much for listening to the end.